Good morning and welcome speakers, some of them old friends of All Energy and some new ones, and all members of the audience to this second webinar in the All Energy Decarbonised Virtual Summit, and the 20th we've held since May. There are around 625 of you gathered in our virtual audience for Speed and Scale, the Race to Hydrogen. I'd like to thank Scottish Power and Ørsted for their sponsorship of the session. Big thanks. I'm Judith Patton, Project Director of our duo of events and the co-creator of All Energy way back at the start of the century. It's time for some housekeeping points. Whilst I talk briefly, my slide will help you get the greatest benefit possible during your time with us today and afterwards. It's important that if you would like to ask questions or rate this webinar, you shrink your screen from full screen to be able to see where to do both things. And if you opt for attachments, you can see all 8 of the webinars being held during this virtual summit. All will be available on demand, not long after transmission, if you can't be with us at broadcast time. One of the very first webinars, masterminded by Matthew Knight, now Head of Business Development at Siemens Energy in the UK, was our original Speed and Scale. Right at the start of the year, he'd said it was a topic he wanted to address at All Energy Decarbonise at SEC in Glasgow in May. That, sadly, was not to be. But as he explained in June in the webinar, to deliver net zero by 2050 with expected growth, we must completely replace the world's energy system of today with something twice the size and greenhouse gas free during the next 30 years. Energy numbers are big. Mega and Giga will not be enough. We must get to Tera and fast. And we have less than 1 billion seconds to do it. Sorry, Matthew, if I've nicked some of your words. When planning the virtual seminar, I took this original idea and asked him, what do you think about concentrating on hydrogen this time? He grasped the nettle enthusiastically, for he spends his time, in his words, making sense of the energy transition. And in addition to his Siemens role, is on the government's carbon capture and storage task force, and importantly for today, the Hydrogen Expert Group. Importantly for me, he is generous of spirit and bounce an idea off him, and he's the man who not only catches it, but shares his thoughts and vision. By the way, he also builds superb sandcastles. Thank you, Matthew. We'll need another Speed and Scale in 2021. Start thinking of the theme. Without more ado, I'd like to wish all of you here today and your families good health in these testing times, and then pass over to Matthew and his fantastic cast of speakers for what I know will be a thought-provoking 90 minutes. Over to you, Matthew.
Thank you, Judith. Good morning. In the first Speed and Scale back in June, we talked about the enormous challenge of delivering net zero by 2050. And if we can have the slide up, please. Baroness Brown gave us these figures for what's needed just for the UK. And as Judith has just said, the numbers are really big. We need to think Tera, not Giga. And we only have 1 billion seconds to deliver. So every second counts. Today, we'll focus on hydrogen's part in meeting that challenge, and especially hydrogen from electrolyzers, and what needs to happen to build a huge new industry from scratch. It's also a race for jobs and inward investment. The place that gets going with hydrogen first will reap the most benefits. The place that starts first wins. Joining me today are an impressive panel who will, each bring us a positive view of what's possible if things go well in their part of the industry. Before I let them do that, let's introduce them all. So I'm Matthew Knight, Head of Business Development for Siemens Energy in the UK. I'm speaking to you from my garden shed at home in the New Forest. And my impressive fact about hydrogen by 2030 is that we'll need to get several gigawatts of green hydrogen production capacity, and that means building at least 2 electrolyser factories of gigawatt scale this decade. So Benj, who are you? Where are you? And what will your industry need to do by 2030? Do we have Benj?
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Matthew. Big question. I'm Ben Sykes. I work for Ørsted. We're an offshore wind developer. We do other things as well. I'll talk about that later. I'm sitting in my house in St Albans in Hertfordshire in England. What is the big exciting thing? Well, offshore wind is going to be driving a lot of the hydrogen growth in the UK and globally. Offshore wind is going to be the backbone of the energy system for Britain, and we've got to build a lot of offshore wind over the next decade and well beyond that. I'll talk about that later, but it's a big challenge, one we can rise to.
And Barry, how about you?
Hello, yeah, so Barry Carruthers, I've kind of wearing 2 hats. Previously, I worked across the businesses in an innovation sustainability role, which means I've seen, across renewables, across networks, and across the kind of customer-facing retail side. But actually, particularly pertinent to this session is we're going through our own transition. So I'm now taking on the role of hydrogen director, and that kind of lends itself well to your kind of question, Matthew, about what we need to do. So companies like us need to build on the good stuff that we've done. So whether it's offshore, onshore, solar, looking into things like battery storage, electrification of transport, electrification of heat. But as we know, hydrogen is one of those enormous tools in the toolbox, hopefully, that can come along and help solve those difficult challenges. So for us, by 2030, personally, I'm really interested to see actually the comparison between what green production of hydrogen looks like and what blue production of hydrogen looks like. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a lot more green hydrogen projects out there.
Thanks, Barry. And Claire.
Hi everyone, my name is Claire Jackson. I work for Acuity. We're energy policy consultancy based up in Birmingham. I'm currently in my kitchen looking out on the wonderful blue skies of Birmingham. So our view at the Hydrogen Task Force is that by 2030, hydrogen needs to be able to meet 75 terawatt hours of final energy demand. And that involves basically needing to have 5 gigawatts of green hydrogen production and 6 gigawatts of blue hydrogen production in place at that point. And we also need to be investing and developing in those midstream and end use technologies at the same time.
And finally, Rita, who are you, where are you, and what do you want us to be doing by 2030?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Rita Wadey. I'm the Deputy Director for the Hydrogen Economy at the Department for Business, Energy and Innovation Strategy. I am in my tiny office in South London at the moment, happily without children around my feet at present. So I think government and industry need to be working together in developing the UK's first hydrogen strategy, which I'm pleased to say we will publish next year. And then, publication of a strategy is a moment, not the moment. We need to then work together on implementation, and government needs to make sure that we are setting a positive direction, removing any barriers, but we really want to make things happen in the 2030s and move beyond sort of talking about hydrogen to putting the UK at the forefront of global hydrogen.
Thanks, panel. Well, I'll let you all speak in a moment, but I'm going to go first as it's my prerogative as chairman. And often when we talk about building an industry, we focus on the top tier players, and the supply chain is assumed to sort of show up and deliver whatever they've decided they need. So I thought I'd start with the supply chain for a change and think about how we build the capability to deliver the hydrogen economy. So to build a successful hydrogen economy, it's widely understood that we need to match supply and demand for hydrogen to make projects happen. But when we're planning this, we also need to match the supply chain for building the hydrogen supply. Someone needs to build the electrolyzers, train the specialist fitters, build the transport and storage infrastructure that will deliver all of that hydrogen. If we take a top-down view, the forecasts for how much hydrogen production we'll need each year by 2050 range from 180 to 500 terawatt hours per year. And if you do a simple calculation, 8,500 hours a year, roughly a 50% load factor, that requires over 100 gigawatts of hydrogen production to be operating by 2050. It's been said that that's the equivalent of building something with the same scale as the entire British electricity system today during the next 30 years. Well, looking back into history, it's worth noting that most of the electricity system that we have today was built in 20 years, between 1948 and 1968. But it was built by a nationalized industry with a post-war zeal, and the industry's capital expenditure was a significant percentage of public spending for those 2 decades. So that's the kind of scale that we need to match if we're building a hydrogen economy. So if we need more than 100 gigawatts of hydrogen production capacity by 2050, we should ramp up to a target of around about 10% of that this decade in order to deliver the other 90% over the following 2 decades. And I've tried drawing the graph for that, and whenever you look at the graph of cumulative installation, you quickly realize how critical the early years are in building enough of a supply chain to deliver at scale later. By the end of this decade, we need to be adding 2 gigawatts of extra capacity every year. And that's why we're going to need at least 2 giga factories up and running by then. Now, factories don't switch on overnight. I was personally involved in bringing Siemens Gamesa's wind turbine blade factory to Hull, and that took 6 years from the first concept to the opening of the factory. And then you need another year or 2 to ramp up to full production. Factories don't appear overnight. The main delay for the Hull factory was uncertainty over the UK market for offshore wind. So the lesson for hydrogen is to signal early the scale of the growing market, and that will help make supply chain investment easier to justify. So we need to be very visible about the projects that people are working on and very clear about how they're going to be financed and how they're going to play a part in the UK's energy transition. Hydrogen projects take time to deliver as well. We need to go through a whole series of projects, starting with small ones at small scale, as you can see on the slide here, initially in things around transport, but moving quite quickly into industry, shipping, putting hydrogen into gas pipes, small gas turbines, small wind farms, medium-sized wind farms, so that by the end of this decade, we're up to that gigawatt scale of large-scale hydrogen from electrolyzers. Excuse me. Meanwhile, and completely separately, we'll be building the carbon storage infrastructure needed to make blue hydrogen, and that also needs to reach gigawatt scale before the end of the decade. And we're going to need to build the infrastructure and the skills for storing, transporting, converting hydrogen into other things, and then converting it back into power. So it's quite a big prospect. And if that all seems expensive, it is, but not when we look at the other investment we need to make to decarbonize other parts of the economy. The good news is that green hydrogen at scale shows all the signs of following the sort of cost reduction curves we've seen with deployment of other new energy technologies. And you can see on the slide here, I won't bother to read it, you can have a look at the slides later, some of the reasons why hydrogen from electrolyzers is bound to get cheaper the more we deploy. The key to everything is to create a visible pipeline of hydrogen projects that releases investment by the supply chain in time to deliver at the scale that we need. If we get it right, the UK will build a new industry and the costs will fall as we learn. So Benj, I'd like to invite you to talk about what the offshore wind industry has to do with hydrogen.
Thanks for that really interesting introduction, Matthew. I think you set the stage very nicely for a great discussion on how we're going to do it, and not whether we're going to do it, but how we're going to do it. Let me first give you a little bit of an introduction, and thank you for putting the slides up, which have magically appeared. Many of you may know Ørsted, but just as a bit of background, we're the largest offshore wind developer in the UK and globally. We've got 26 operational offshore wind farms already, including the world's biggest one off the east coast of England, and we've got around 7 gigawatts of installed capacity. We also do have growing onshore wind, solar PV and storage businesses, as well as bioenergy CHP. And as you can see from the sticker in the corner of my introductory slide, late last year we were rated the world's most sustainable company, which was a great success for us. We transformed ourselves from an oil and gas company to an entirely renewables driven business, and it's very exciting to be on this journey with many of you in the audience. So as Matthew said, where does the world's leading offshore wind developer and operator fit into the hydrogen story? Well, we firmly believe that renewable hydrogen, or green hydrogen if you prefer, we like renewable because it's not just a question of what color it is, it's where it comes from. But renewable hydrogen produced from carbon-free offshore wind electrons and using electrolysis will ultimately be the preferred route to deliver the decarbonisation of the wider economy that we need. That's industrial, heat, heavy transport, and ultimately aviation and deep marine shipping. And so it's great to be part of the panel, given the ambitions of the Scottish Government to be net zero by 2040 and across the UK by 2050, to look at what practical and tangible actions we can take to turn the story of hydrogen, and there's a lot of talk about hydrogen, has been for a couple of years, turning that into a reality. So a bit of context, the UK is now committed to delivering 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, with 11 gigawatts of that here in Scotland, and by the latest estimates, at least 100 gigawatts by 2050. You may have heard the Committee on Climate Change talk about that recently. I wouldn't be surprised if we see expectations well above 100 gigawatts, bearing in mind that we are currently at around 10 or so gigawatts, 10 to 12 gigawatts in the UK, so we've got a long way to go. And I know we're all virtual, but All Energy is a great Scottish conference, and Scotland is the perfect place to be using this powerhouse of green electricity, offshore wind, to develop and commercialise this power to X idea, and specifically power to hydrogen. But I think that's enough background. Let's take a look at what we're up to in Ørsted and how we believe projects like the one I'm about to show you can unlock the pathway to low-cost renewable hydrogen and delivering that deep carbonisation that I spoke about earlier. I hope you can now see the Giga stack image. This is an example of how hydrogen produced from offshore wind can and will be part of the future energy system. It's our Giga stack project in the Humber. Giga stack is a venture between Ørsted, Phillips 66, who have a refinery in North Lincolnshire, ITM Power, one of the world's leading developers and manufacturers of electrolyzers, and Element Energy. It's based on the south side of the Humber, and it's currently in its FEED, its front-end engineering and design phase. Once we've fully developed it, the project is designed to take power from Hornsea 2, which is currently in construction offshore the east of England. It's just about 50 miles from the Yorkshire coast, just started construction a couple of months ago offshore. That will land its power at Killingholme near Grimsby, and it'll power a 100 megawatt electrolyser system, which will then send the hydrogen it produces over to the Phillips 66 refinery to be used in their refining processes and displacing hydrogen, which is currently produced by SMR using fossil fuels. So a huge opportunity for a point-to-point reduction in emissions from, if you like, the tip of the turbine through to the fossil fuels that they are producing at the refinery. There are a number of exciting elements to the project. Firstly, it's supporting the direct decarbonisation of an energy-intensive industry. We know how we're going to clean up and decarbonise our electricity system. We've demonstrated that offshore wind is going to be able to do that at large scale in the UK and across the world. But now we're working in partnership with companies across the UK and globally, actually, for options to decarbonise to support their future as they also drive emissions, carbon emissions out of their businesses. Hydrogen partnerships and clusters can be formed in key industrial centres around the country, which is why we're doing it in the Humber with Philips. But of course, there are other places, not least Grangemouth in Scotland, but also Teesside and other parts of the UK where these point-to-point projects and clusters can form to drive emissions down in industrial processes. And the work we're doing in GigaStack's really helpful to show us more clearly what are the commercial and regulatory hurdles we need to clear, because the purpose of this panel is to discuss how we're actually going to do it. Our GigaStack project is really opening up a much greater understanding of what we need to see changed in regulation. I'm sure Rita will talk about that, but also what do we need to see in terms of innovation and cost out to enable GigaStack project and projects like it to achieve their full potential. I'll touch a bit on some of this a little bit later. So what do we need to do to deliver a hydrogen economy by 2050? So the first stage is what we call peer-to-peer projects or point-to-point projects. This will allow the first projects to develop, connecting production with one particular user of hydrogen, like in GigaStack, such as a refinery or production facility. And it's already happening in our project and elsewhere. We're also doing one in the Netherlands with Yara, where we'll be using renewable energy from our offshore wind farms to produce clean hydrogen for ammonia manufacturing and ultimately for fertilizer production. We know that that's a big source of climate greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, we'll move from point to point into clusters, and that will mean developing one or more producers of hydrogen linking to multiple users. And I expect we could see this in industrial hubs such as Grangemouth, Teesside and the Humber. This is the concept in the Green Fuel for Denmark project we announced recently. Some of you may have seen it. Consortium of Ørsted, Copenhagen Airport, SAS Airlines and shipping and transport companies such as Maersk Moller and DFDS. And it's a project that will see an offshore wind farm, a very large one, ultimately connected to directly to provide electrolysis, which can then produce the renewable hydrogen that we can use in synthetic fuels for aircraft, shipping and other uses. And then ultimately, out in the 2030s and 2040s, we expect to see a fully integrated hydrogen grid developing. It's some way off, but we believe the country will have a mature market with producers and users of hydrogen connected through a network. And of course, again, Scotland is very well placed here, given its current network of pipelines from the northeast to Grangemouth and the central belt. So what's important in stages 1 and 2 is co-locating power to hydrogen facilities close to the renewable energy sources and close to those energy intensive industries that are going to use the hydrogen. It avoids costs associated with building extensive onshore transmission, and it also means projects can benefit from avoiding expensive electricity transmission charges. Very important in all markets, not least Scotland. And I'm sure in the discussion later we'll talk about some of the regulatory changes such as around electricity transmission charging that will unlock this green future for hydrogen. And ultimately this development strategy can also help stabilize the grid by providing flexible demand services once dedicated hydrogen grid and storage infrastructure is in place. And there's a report published just today that talks in some depth about that. Certainly worth a Google if you have time later. So how are we going to do it? How are we going to get the cost out? On the left, you can see what we've done in offshore wind. I'm sure this will be a story familiar to many of you, but we know through scale up industrialization and the right regulatory framework, we can drive costs down tremendously. Matthew's already mentioned it. We've seen it in offshore wind, also in other technologies. And as the global leader in offshore wind, we see that there's a very similar journey that we can follow for cost reduction in electrolyzers themselves. the process of industrialization will bring down the costs, and the technology will develop. The cost of manufacturing will benefit from the economies of scale, as Matthew talked about, with giga scale factories, and the supply chain will develop and grow to support production. Great to see the UK moving quickly on this. As Matthew says, we need to move to get that first mover advantage and make sure that this burgeoning supply chain is anchored in the UK. But the major reduction in cost will come, as you can see on the right, in OPEX, and particularly the cost of electricity. And this isn't just about the cost of electricity on the wholesale market, although of course it does help that electricity from new build wind and solar is now cheaper than electricity from new build coal or gas. Those costs will continue to come down, but it's also about avoiding other costs, adapting transmission charges and other regulatory charges that are not designed to reward and incentivize the production and use of renewable hydrogen. And of course, government has a role to play in this. First and foremost, it's about designing a regulatory framework to support these early projects. Renewable hydrogen is, of course, more expensive at the moment than that produced from unabated SMR. So we need a mechanism that will support producers of renewable hydrogen so they can compete in the market, but also the users of renewable hydrogen. We've seen the renewable obligation being a very powerful tool to pull through demand. We've seen things like the CFD being very powerful to create investment space for construction of the capacity needed. And I think we need both of these. I'm sure we'll talk about them in more detail later. But we need both, I think, if we're going to see hydrogen accelerate at the pace Matthew's talked about. And then finally, for those of you who want to read a bit more, I'm not going to talk about it now, but we've just recently published a white paper on our vision for hydrogen and Power to X. Would encourage you to dig that out from our website and have a read. It's a gripping read, and I think it will give you some insights, certainly has for me, into how we're going to get through this journey successfully. Thank you.
Barry, your job title is Director of Hydrogen for Scottish Power. So what does that involve?
So, I mean, I guess for context for why that role now exists, if you think, so Scottish Power being part of the wider global Iberdrola group, operating in many countries across the world, we've said and we've acknowledged that hydrogen will have a role to play, so let's go for it. Let's make sure it's green. So we've done so well with renewable electricity generation, distribution, and getting that to customers at an ever better price all the time, and actually stretched into new areas that it's never been before. So let's build upon that. So I think the context, if we kind of think the kind of 80-90%, we still think is electrification will get us a very long way very, very quickly. That's exactly what we should do. And then that 10 to 20% becomes a challenge for hydrogen to come along and help be that additional tool in the box, as it were. So, you know, a bit like many people listening to this, and I'm sure on the panel, we all kind of know the kind of key sectors and the main areas we want to go to, and where this kind of lends itself well, one of which being whiskey and gin. By the way, we need to make sure they're completely carbon free, because then we get guilt-free drinking by 2030, and also Guinness, that's on the list. But what it really means, I guess, is that we need to look at that full value chain. I'm really conscious that, certainly from my point of view, we don't want to be running around with a hydrogen hammer looking for nails. That's one of the kind of things that could really shoot us in the foot, because if you think about the electrification solutions out there, and I'll give you an example where we were talking to a collaboration partner on a potential project that we'll do very soon, where actually they called us in because they thought hydrogen was the answer, and they were convinced that actually we'll get this. If you could build and own and operate electrolyzers, let's get some new renewable electricity to feed it. This is how we'll use the hydrogen. And within about an hour, we knew that actually electrification was the best solution for them. So I think that's a really important context part, that we don't want to be running around creating kind of false dawns. What we do need to do is be more targeted. So a bit like Ben's covered very well, and you've covered well yourself, Matthew, the sectors that really need help, whether it's distilleries, steel, refineries, all these things, absolutely. But it may well be that heavy transport, for example, is one of the ones that comes to the fore quickest. There's two particular projects that we're working on right now. In Spain, we have a very large project kicking off, which is focused on ammonia. for fertilizer production. Of course, a massive contributor of CO2. So that's a target really worth aiming at. And in that project, we're building a 100 megawatt solar feeding into 20 megawatt battery storage and 20 megawatt electrolyzer. And so it uses a balance of electricity distribution and hydrogen distribution. So a great example, but again, a bit about the idea of scaling up over time. That envisages to be an 800 megawatt, if not bigger, project in the coming years. And then similarly in Scotland, we have a project where we are using a new solar and potentially some wind from our Whiteley wind farm on the south side of Glasgow to feed electrolyzer, which then will create low-cost hydrogen for local vehicles, heavy transport. So things like bin lorries, potentially buses. Again, just another case study. The way I kind of see the next kind of, let's say, 1 to 5 years being a portfolio of projects that I think we all need to see. So we don't want to see 20 projects all doing exactly the same thing. I think we do need to see that spread so we can see the art of the possible. And then by the time you get to 2030, it's kind of, what's the wisest application? And when we see that scale and the cost reductions that you talk about come through, that could be a really exciting time. We will be looking as in two different ways. I would say the strategy is you do get those single customers, the kind of one-to-one, the bilateral projects where you have a very clear use, a very clear production, and you can get renewables to support it. That's an excellent kind of way to take a project forward. But I do see this cluster idea not just being in the large industrial clusters. I do see more kind of regional clusters emerging as well, and that might start with kind of one hook, and it might be a local industrial use, which is basically the lion's share of demand. But then it may well be a local bus company, a haulage firm, could be a small kind of microbrewery, distillery, and then it could be some injection into a closed gas network, for example. These kind of clusters are starting to emerge, I would say. And the interesting thing about that is they can be very geographically spread. So we talk about things like just transition and making sure that no one's left behind. And quite often that gets into a conversation emerging from electric vehicles, heat pump kind of deployment across the UK. And people always come back with, well, whatever, 80% of the UK is connected to gas. Well, pretty much 100% of the UK is connected to electricity. So if there's a way in which we can bring together that total picture, which is geographically fair and well dispersed, of electrification of transport where it makes sense, electrification of heating, vast majority of the time, and hydrogen, particularly green hydrogen, coming along to fill that role of, for example, shipping, regional aviation. Those things can really start to give you a nice regional cluster. And what interests me about that is they are largely buildable now. We're not waiting on decades for future technologies. We're not waiting on really large-scale blue hydrogen facilities. We're not waiting on really large-scale CCS. We can go out and build green hydrogen projects tomorrow. Yes, at modest scale, and that's absolutely appropriate. But if we can, get that scalability and the kind of modular element from the supply chain, which is really interesting. And again, you've mentioned people like IT and Power. The way that we actually build that supply chain in a modular fashion means that if we go out and build a 10 megawatt project here or a 50 megawatt project here in the first 5 years, as long as they're scalable, as the kind of use cases increase and the demand increases, each of those 10 megawatt projects can grow into 100 megawatt, if not 500 megawatt projects by the end of the decade. So I think it's a massively exciting time. It's certainly an interesting area for us to commit to. As I say, we've got such a great pipeline in offshore, onshore wind and solar PV. We're also doing large-scale battery storage, and hydrogen production is yet another thing that allows us to have an additional tool in the box that allows us to really tackle those climate change targets, not just 2030 but beyond.
Great. Thank you, Barry. That was really interesting. I have a picture in my mind of a hydrogen hammer now, which I'm trying to work out how that would really work. For those of you who are watching, please don't forget to send in your questions. We have 2 more speakers, and then we're going to have a panel discussion responding to your questions. So please use the facility that you'll Judith described earlier. So moving on, Claire, what's Acuity doing with hydrogen?
Sure. Can everybody see that screen? Or can somebody say we can see the screen? Hopefully you can. Acuity, so I've been working for Acuity for about the last 5 years, and I've been leading our work on hydrogen there. I like to tell people that I've been working in hydrogen before it was cool. I know there's probably a lot of people who are watching this who've been working in hydrogen a lot longer than us. But so the Hydrogen Task Force is probably the latest thing that we've been doing in hydrogen. The task force launched in March of this year in the House of Commons. I think we were probably the last thing that happened in the House of Commons before everything locked down. But the aim of the Hydrogen Task Force is essentially to bring together some of the organizations that are leading on hydrogen across the whole value chain to make that high-level energy system, economic, environmental case for hydrogen in the UK. Essentially to develop a vision of what hydrogen in the UK could look like. And then to develop some sort of joint positions and some joint ideas on what the next steps are that the UK needs to sort of do now in order to make that vision a reality. So our view is that essentially we have two key questions that we need to answer in 2020. The first is like, what is the role of hydrogen in the UK? And the second thing is, what do we need to do now to achieve that? And there's a number of different things that come into that. So the questions like, how much hydrogen do we need? If we have hydrogen, which sectors should it be used in? How much carbon could we save using it? What are the sort of energy system implications? Looking at it in that sort of wider context. Where can the UK take a global leadership position, and where should it be a fast follower? You know, what existing assets and expertise do we have in the UK that we should be looking to leverage? And if we do that, what are the sort of economic benefits of doing that? But it's not just about answering those questions. I think those are really important questions that the industry need to come together to put together the evidence base that will allow you know, government investors to make decisions now for the future. But the other key question is, what do we actually need to do now? You know, we can sometimes get, I think, a little bit too focused on that sort of 2050 picture and trying to understand exactly what it's going to look like. And that is important. But also it's about sort of moving the next step forwards, knowing that we are going to need hydrogen in some capacity. So understanding what are the barriers to hydrogen? How do we go about sort of trying to reduce some of the costs? What's the respective roles of government and industry? How do we ensure and encourage coordination across sectors and between production and demand, so we're not a bunch of nails looking for hammers or hammers looking for nails? I love that picture, by the way. How do we ensure that we've got the right skills within the UK? Making sure that we've got the right sort of training programs in place. What kind of infrastructure will we need? And also, I think, so this part sometimes gets a little bit lost, but how do we ensure that we take consumers along that journey with us? So it's not just industry doing a whole bunch of behind the scenes and then ta-da, it's there it is. That actually consumers are a part of that journey. So one of the things that we do at the Hydrogen Task Force is trying to put some of the evidence behind the sort of hydrogen case, the hydrogen story. So we've recently published an economic impact assessment. I must say we actually started this piece of work about this time last year, not knowing really that at the point where it was going to be published, that we'd be in the middle of a sort of pandemic and economic crisis, and that actually, you know, economic recovery would be, you know, up there with, you know, the sort of topics of conversation. So it's actually ended up being sort of quite timely. And I think it's all about answering this question of, you know, what is it about, you know, the UK can build back, you know, bigger and better, but what does it look like for the UK to build back greener and more sustainable? And what can the role of hydrogen be, not only in providing sort of good quality jobs, not just in a single burst, but also in a way that's going to sustain. And I think that's why we've seen the likes of, you know, some of our neighbors such as Germany, including hydrogen as not just a solution for tackling climate change, but also as a solution for economic recovery. So the task force has done this piece of work to try and estimate the economic value and job creation across the whole entire value chain. So upstream, both blue and green production, that midstream transmission and distribution and energy storage aspects, and then those four downstream end use sectors, so power generation, transport, heat and buildings, and industry. There's quite a lot of detail that's gone on behind this. I would encourage you, if you are an economics nerd and want to get down and dirty in the details with those, then you can go on the Hydrogen Task Force website and you can find the sort of detail of that. But these are sort of essentially the headline figures. So if we invest in hydrogen, we could potentially by 2035 be unlocking around 18 billion in GVA and create 75,000 jobs on that 2035 timeframe. And you can actually see on these pie charts, actually, that's pretty well spread across different sectors. You know, it's not all about, you know, jobs in production, but also it's in those end use sectors as well. So potentially the prize that's available, not just from a energy system and climate change perspective, but also from an economic perspective, is potentially very large. And this is just looking at 2035 without even looking to sort of move out to 2050. But I think the really key thing is this will only happen if we act now. We can't just wait and allow other nations to sort of move ahead of us. If we want to see that value created here in the UK, then the UK has to be a first mover. So the task force has also been doing some work as to what we think those next steps are in each of those areas. As I said, it's not about trying to like solve the entire 2050 problem now, but it's about, you know, we have these different areas that we know that we need in hydrogen, you know, production. We know there's going to be an infrastructure challenge. We know there's going to be a hydrogen storage piece, and then some of those end use technologies, which are all in, you know, slightly different levels of development and technology readiness. You know, there's some where there's still some questions to be answered, but there's others where you know, those demonstrator projects are done, and now what we need is scale. So it's identifying what are the sort of next steps in each of those areas to sort of move that forwards. This is sort of, I mean, my marketing manager would kill me for such a basic diagram, but I did this myself, I'm afraid, so it doesn't look particularly flashy. But essentially, we need to solve the production problem. So we need to start in order to get those sort of that sort of scale, we need to start looking at you know, CFD for green hydrogen, developing that business model for blue hydrogen and solving that, and actually pressing the green button on blue hydrogen, and particularly on that CCUS side as well. And then in terms of unlocking some stuff in the sort of midstream, we need a change to the regulations that will allow hydrogen blending. So industry needs to get on, make that safety case so that we can allow to start using that gas grid as an early off taker for that hydrogen. It's not enough to just have the supply and assume that the demand side will happen. The view of the Hydrogen Task Force is that based on our sort of initial analysis, which we are doing more detail on at the moment, for every pound that you're spending on production, you need a corresponding pound for that midstream and endstream technologies. We also need to be developing hydrogen storage pilots. We know that's something that we're going to need, so we need to start moving on that now. And then in terms of the end use, our view is we need to deploy 100 hydrogen refueling stations by 2025. That will be particularly focused on some of those larger vehicles, some of those vehicles that are ready to go now, like buses. But we also want to create the environment where the likes of Hyundai want to bring their trucks to the UK. There is going to be a global competition for vehicles. So we need to make the UK an attractive place to be deploying those initial early stage vehicles. We talked, and others have talked about the sort of industrial side of things. This is going to be a key part, particularly for the sort of mid to late end of this decade. So we need to get moving on supporting those hydrogen industrial clusters. Many of those have phases. So, you know, can we start by getting each of those to the first phase, maybe a couple to the second and third phase by the end of the decade? And then hydrogen for heat. This is a big question, you know. Heat is probably one of the biggest challenges in terms of decarbonisation, and hydrogen offers a really interesting opportunity there of utilising existing assets, but there's some questions there. You know, it's not fully, we don't have the full picture yet, so we need to prioritise live hydrogen heating trials so that we can, you know, essentially, again, press the green button on hydrogen heating and demonstrate what there is left to be demonstrated in that area. So I'm just going to finish by saying at the Hydrogen Task Force, we are really excited about the UK hydrogen strategy. I think, as Rita said in her introduction, it's a moment in time. It's not the moment in time. You know, hydrogen will develop in the years to come. It's not just about this moment, but this is a really important thing to get right. And we've seen, I pinched this slide that I saw actually on LinkedIn yesterday from the World Energy Council, which just sort of demonstrates how many nations are developing their hydrogen strategy and have released their hydrogen strategies this year. So we're really keen that the UK hydrogen strategy is bold and ambitious, and really sets the UK in a position where we can compete with these other nations and take a leading role in hydrogen. Yeah, so the Hydrogen Task Force is really excited to be a part of that process, and looking forward to next spring and getting moving with this.
Thank you very much indeed, Claire. That's inspiring enthusiasm. Government clearly has a big role to play in this, and our final speaker is from the UK government. But Rita, I know you've been working on this for a while, and government gets these things. What can we in the industry do to work with government to make this a reality?
Yep. Thank you, Matthew. Hopefully you can see those slides. So thanks very much for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to give you an update on what we are doing in BEIS. Just some of this will be a very quick canter. I just want to set out the scene of what we're doing, and other things I'll skip over a bit, but when the slides are shared afterwards, you'll be able to see a bit more detail. So I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on the UK context, because that's been set out by other speakers, particularly Matthew, but just to say that we do see hydrogen as critical to meeting net zero. I've long been saying that it's not about electricity or hydrogen, it's about both. Hydrogen is a complement and an enabler to a deeply renewable, deeply decarbonised system. We do believe that the UK has a near unique position on hydrogen, as Matthew said. We've got really suitable geography and geology. We've got our gas system expertise, electrochemical expertise. We've got our energy market and the way that we have created regulations and support systems for other technologies. And we also have a lot of good end use cases for hydrogen. There is potential for us to use it across the system. We see that industry would be potentially the largest role in 2050. But we could use it in our heating systems for power generation and in heavy transport, as others have said. So UK hydrogen strategy, we've been talking in code about this for quite some time, but on the 10th of September, Alok Sharma publicly committed to publish a hydrogen strategy, a UK hydrogen strategy. There's a nice screenshot of the it was the Environmental Audit Committee in the House of Commons, or not quite in the House of Commons, that he mentioned that at. This is an area that our ministers are really keen on. We're working very closely with Minister Kwarteng, who's got high ambition for the strategy and wants it to be meaningful. He wants it to be not just about intent, but to have more detail around policy involved in it. We want it to be there's a lot going on hydrogen in the UK, and we're all aware of those things. We want the strategy to be somewhere we can bring those things together to showcase what's going on in the UK and the support that the government at all levels has been giving. As Claire has said, the time now is to focus on what we need to do in the 2020s to get things going. It's going to be a decade of learning by doing. We need assurance around things like the cost, around safety, around the coordination of supply and demand, so that we know that hydrogen can play the role we think it needs to in 2050. And as others have said, we very much want to talk about the economic benefits. It's the other side of the decarbonisation coin, and it is particularly important at the moment. We think that hydrogen can play an important role in the UK's clean, resilient recovery, and we're putting effort into thinking about supply chain, jobs and skills and export opportunities, and learning from what we've done well or less well in the development of other energy technologies, and that includes the oil and gas industry, that includes offshore wind. We're also thinking about the chemical sector and how that could play a part in the supply chain. So the strategy will very much cover those things, and as others have said today, there's a role for various actors in that. Government can set out ambition and set a clear signal, but many of us are going to need to work together to deliver. So in terms of sequencing, I mean, these are difficult and extraordinary times, and we're dealing with quite a lot of uncertainty in timetabling for things. But this is what we anticipate the next few months may look like. So towards the end of this year, we'll have the spending review. I think it's the 25th of November. We're still working through what the spending review is going to look like in light of the Treasury announcement that it would, for the most part, be a one-year rollover. The Energy White Paper is being closely developed, and the spending review contributes to that. The CCC give their advice on Carbon Budget 6 in very early December. Then sectoral strategies that are important from a hydrogen point of view, the heat and building strategy, the transport decarbonisation plan. These are all things that we're going to want to reflect on. There'll be hydrogen throughout these things. We'll bring those things together in the hydrogen strategy, which will be published in a similar time frame to the industrial decarbonisation strategy. Claire and Benj in particular have mentioned the importance of long-term sustainable policy, particularly around incentive mechanisms or business models. Alongside the strategy, we are intending to publish a Minded To consultation on a preferred business model for hydrogen. There's a lot of work going on in this space at the moment. A number of you will be involved in the hydrogen expert group and will have noted the Frontier Economics report that we published earlier this year in September alongside the government response to the CCUS review of delivery and investment frameworks. It's a big and complicated area because it's a whole system, whole value chain conundrum. So thinking about production, but also thinking about the demand side, the instruments that already exist in the demand side and how they might be applicable to hydrogen. And we'll be putting together a package of material in spring. And then later on in the run up to COP26, there'll be other opportunities to update, give further information or announcements if anything emerges. So just to touch on production, and a couple of others have touched on it today, just as it's not electricity or hydrogen, we don't see it as blue or green, but both. I know that others will have different views around this, but in our view, blue hydrogen is going to be important as a transition for getting volume and scale in the 2020s that will support innovation and investment across the value chain. But we really do want to stimulate private sector investment and develop a wide range of projects so that we can also nurture UK hydrogen, renewable hydrogen expertise. Like you, Benj, I also prefer not to use the colours, but have very much fallen into it in recent months because it is a handy shorthand. And deploy today's technology, but also build on the potential that we have in the UK to be leaders in renewable hydrogen on a pathway to net zero. And that approach has been informing the way that we're doing our work so far. So in innovation under the hydrogen supply competition, we are supporting both blue and green hydrogen projects. Giga is supported under our energy innovation programme. There's a floating offshore wind hydrogen project under that. It's informing our development of the low carbon hydrogen fund. It's in the business model development, and it will be a big story for the strategy. I'm not going to go into detail on the funding landscape at the moment, partly because this may change depending on where we land with the spending review, but just to focus, we've been funding innovation across the supply chain, across the value chain under the Energy Innovation Programme. At the budget in March, a Net Zero Innovation Fund, a continuation of that programme of £1 billion was announced, and we anticipate that will have support for hydrogen. The £800 million CCS Infrastructure Fund, which will be a key enabler for hydrogen at scale, and the Low Carbon Hydrogen Production Fund, which was announced last year, is under development, and that's looking at taking these innovation projects to deployment. So stakeholder input, I've said that we need to work closely together. We formed a Hydrogen Advisory Council that is chaired by Minister Kwarteng and Sinead Lynch, the UK country chair from Shell. That's met twice now. We expect it to run for a couple of years, and it's going to meet again in December and more frequently in the run up to the strategy. And that's a really great meeting of people, enormous amounts of enthusiasm around the table. It's great to have sort of CEO level conversations where the CEOs are really plugged into hydrogen, as Claire was saying, and others have said, we've been working on hydrogen at a point where we wouldn't have been able to have those conversations, but we're having them now, and that feels very different. Underneath the Hydrogen Advisory Council, which is necessarily quite small, we're in the process of establishing a number of working groups that will look to work with us on development of the strategy, but also very much think about implementation. Back to that a moment, not the moment. We need to be working together to make things happen, and we're setting up a number of work streams to enable that. So next steps, it's going to be an extremely busy few months. The HAC working groups will be up and running from this month. We'll be updating on our business model thinking before the end of the year, ahead of that consultation, which is going to be on a preferred model. We're engaged on the Low Carbon Hydrogen Fund. There'll be various opportunities to engage in strategy development. And then spring 21 for the hydrogen strategy publication, if things go the way we're hoping to, and that consultation on the business models alongside the strategy. So thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you very much, Rita, and thank you to all of our speakers. Now, Rita, I'm aware that you're going to have to leave us very shortly, so can I just quickly throw a couple of questions at you that have come in from the audience, and then we'll catch up with other things later on.
Terribly sorry to have to leave. It was definitely not my intent.
Yeah. Well, let's prioritize two of these. I'll feed them both to you, and you can think about how to respond. So the first one, combining a couple of questions here. How do we engage with the public on all of this? And who blows the starting whistle? You used the phrase a moment, not the moment, but how do we say the UK hydrogen economy is going now? And then the second one is a little bit about the timescale. You're consulting on a business model sort of spring next year. What's the opportunity to get a few early Pathfinder projects away before we've got the sort of the full business model in place, because presumably that will take time?
Yeah. And
when do you see the first round of bids, or whatever the process is going to be, for that for the low carbon hydrogen production fund, once it's developed?
Okay, thanks very much. So just quickly, first round of bids on low carbon hydrogen production fund. We're hoping to do some consultation for the remainder of this year and the beginning of next year to start. We want that fund to be open for bids next year, recognising that it's been quite a while, but we are very much thinking about the alignment with the CCS infrastructure fund. So there's quite a few things that need to come together there. Yes, we recognise that there is a delay in the business models. I think it would be interesting to talk about Pathfinder projects, and that's something that we want to think about in in the context of the low carbon hydrogen fund while we're working up that business model. So that is certainly something I can't commit to now, but is on our radar for something to be thinking about, and also thinking about, you know, the role that other instruments have in supporting hydrogen there. Who blows the starting whistle? Well, I remember when I first started working in this area, people always said to me, you know, there is a UK hydrogen economy now, and the challenge is we need to scale it up, decarbonise it, and get it to enter other sectors. And I think that's where we are. So I think, in a way, I think the strategy is an option to bring things together and showcase what's already happening, because things are already happening and projects are out there, and we know that they're waiting for a clearer signal from government and for the policy framework. But then we expect things to be able to happen quite quickly. So I think the gun's probably already been fired. And I just hope that we can kind of accelerate, get everyone off the starting blocks pretty quickly, but recognizing that it will, there's always frustration from the industry that we aren't moving faster, and we do recognize that, and we put pressure to get things moving. And we have been trying to do, you know, the work on business models began last year. It hasn't just, we haven't been waiting for the strategy to do that, and hopefully, as Minister Kwarteng wants for us to have some substance alongside the strategy on things like the business models, that will mean that we can get moving in the UK pretty quickly, because we know that other countries are still thinking about their CFD designs, where, for example, where they're using those. And engaging with the public, yes, certainly something that is important, and we are aware of various studies that were done, not least by the CCC, on engagement with the public and how important it is to kind of frame the conversation in a way that can bring people with you. And that's certainly something we'll be thinking about as part of the hydrogen strategy, and is certainly something that's being thought about, for example, for the heat and building strategy, where decarbonisation is going to be such an important you know, people need to act to get that stuff going. So that we're going to be engaging with the public on net zero and things that need to happen across the piece, and we'll make sure that hydrogen is part of that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Just before you go, can we just say thank you? Because there are lots of government exercises and lots of grand plans, but you've done a pretty good job of keeping us informed of progress as you've gone along and involving stakeholders. And obviously, we all hope that will continue. There's no reason why it shouldn't.
No. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with hydrogen stakeholders over the years. So thank you very much for helping us make the case. All right. Thank you very much. I'm afraid I have to go.
Right. Well, it's time to put some questions to the rest of the panel now. So perhaps if we can all hear. Several questions came in. Let's throw out one to all of you before we get into others. Just, is the UK ahead or behind or in the pack on hydrogen generally, and what do we need to do to be leaders in this? Anyone like to grab that one? I guess, Claire, you spoke about the need to act now.
I mean, I would say in many areas we are ahead of the pack. I mean, if you look at electrolyzers, for example, the UK is home to the world's largest electrolyzer factory. You know, Germany's largest green hydrogen project uses UK-built technology. In many ways, the UK is very well positioned for hydrogen. You know, we've got the world's best offshore wind capacity. We've got the world's most extensive gas grid. We've got in the world, I don't know whether it's the world's, we've got extensive CO2 storage assets. The UK is so well positioned on hydrogen. I think we're a little bit behind in terms of some of our sort of public statements on hydrogen. So many other nations have laid out their ambitions for hydrogen. I'd say that's an area where we're lagging. We need some bold statements about what we want to achieve in hydrogen. But I'd say in many areas, UK is leading the way.
Thank you. Anything to add?
Just to say, very, very hard to disagree with that. Obviously, it's great to have formal targets, policies written down in concrete that you can really start to build business plans, investment plans around, along with funding mechanisms. But the truth is, we've done such a great job of getting low-cost renewable electricity into our system that, for many reasons, actually, I completely agree, we are well set up.
I suppose all I would add, pardon me, is from where we sit, there's a lot going on, and I think the point Claire makes about getting some noise is really important. If you're looking where you're going to build your Giga factory to make electrolyzers, we've seen from your slide, Claire, lots of hydrogen strategies popping up in countries all over Europe and elsewhere. We need to be telling the story, so that in the same way offshore wind has become the UK's become the go-to place, we need that to happen for hydrogen. I think the strategy will be the key enabler for that noise that will make us, if you like, come from the middle of the pack and charge out to the front just when the timing's right.
Thank you. A couple of questions that were specifically directed at Benj. I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at them, but
try me.
Yeah, so the first one was from Nigel Holmes at the Scottish Hydrogen and Fuel Cells Association, and with a particular Scottish flavour, but he talked about the importance of co-locating sources of renewable hydrogen with users such as ammonia or power-to-X. And what opportunities are there for Scotland in this? And is there anything that you can learn from the projects you're already working on that would apply?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, Nigel. I think there are definitely opportunities. Obviously, there are a growing number of offshore wind farms in Scotland, and we're very excited about being able to see that grow. Orsted, as much as anyone else, very excited about Scotland leasing round and the opportunity to start creating those point-to-point connections that I spoke about in my talk. So there are real opportunities. I mentioned Grangemouth, there are others in Scotland, not just on the east coast, but around Scotland, where we can connect this growing fleet of offshore wind farms. I mentioned Scottish Government's ambition for 11 gigawatts over the next 10 years. So I think there are definitely opportunities. Let's see where those wind farms get built. But with the scale of heavy industrial and petrochem use of hydrogen in Scotland, there are real opportunities, absolutely.
Barry, the one I think you were going to pick up, I'm not sure who this question is from, but they're saying that we're in a situation where all the renewable energy we make could be utilised exclusively for electricity. What are the drivers for wanting to divert some of that to generate green hydrogen?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because I guess this goes back to one of the things that I tried to mention earlier, which is making sure we're trying to get the right solution for the challenge. And the way I see it is, we have to find the people or the industry or the technical challenge that actually requires hydrogen. Not that we're trying to shoehorn electricity into another technology. You lose obviously efficiency whenever you convert from one energy to another. So there's a few examples out there that don't really ring true to me. Things like electricity into fuel cell technology with some kind of concept of storage and then releasing it back at some point in the future. But obviously, that's a massively inefficient process in itself. So you have to have a real driver for that, for example. So I think other attractive areas are where electrical connections obviously are a challenge. That lends itself to things like rural locations, coastal locations, this kind of small clustering idea that I was talking about. And of course, where we might find congestion in certain points of the network, that lends itself to another energy vector, obviously. So I think there's a few examples out there, some of which will benefit from things like changes in transmission charging. As we all know, that could really hold back some of the bigger deployment opportunities, particularly in Scotland and the north. But also where we actually just find a bilateral kind of single point user where hydrogen really is the solution that they need. And actually you don't need to worry about massive transmission connections at all. Actually, you just build what you need for that solution and keep it a contained project. That can also work really well.
Just three questions, which I think I'll throw at myself, that have come from different people. There's a number of different questions along the lines of, how do people get engaged? This industry sounds exciting. It sounds like it's just getting going. How can individuals and businesses get engaged? So in response to that, and I'll ask the others to join in a moment, I think the first thing to say is, this is a massively growing future market, and you've got to be in it to win it. And if you get into it somewhere, all ships float on a rising tide. If you're in the hydrogen economy somewhere, as it grows, you almost can't help growing with it. So find a way in, find a niche. And the way to do that is probably to look for a project, something that's local to you, something that you can bring your particular expertise to bear, that brings a source of hydrogen with a use of hydrogen together in a package, and try and create a sort of shovel-ready project. We've heard from Rita that the government is working on a whole series of different incentives for projects that will be consulted on and then announced during the course of the next 6 to 12 months. If you've got a project that's ready to go to take advantage of that, then we can get the industry going as soon as government brings forward the detail of the ideas. Have others got some suggestions as to how people can get involved with the hydrogen economy?
So I guess one thing just to add to that, Matthew, is, there's a lot actually already out there that talks to the specifics of what a hydrogen project is. We've sort of talked in general terms. I've shown some very cartoonish images of a hydrogen project. If you've got a business and want to know, can I break into the supply chain for a hydrogen project? There's plenty out there already, I think, that will give you a sense of where you might be able to bring your expertise, your technology to bear. I would say this, wouldn't I, as chair of the Offshore Wind Industry Council? I think having something like a hydrogen industry council that can then tell the story and promote the opportunities in a tangible way, rather than in sort of generic cartoon-like ways as I've done, will be really helpful. So I'm hoping something like that may come along as part of the strategy as well.
Barry, anything to add? How people can get into the industry?
Yeah, just building on what Ben said. I mean, you'll have heard Nigel Holmes's name mentioned at the Scottish Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association, and of course there's the UK Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association as well. But the thing is, the way I kind of approach in this sector is, there's so many people that have been working in this for a long time, and actually it is a fairly well connected network, as it were. So, you probably only need to chat to Nigel for about 7 minutes, and then you probably know everybody anyway. So, but I think the point being that, yes, there's a lot going on, but a lot of it's kind of interconnected. So actually just making contact with people like myself, actually, it's such a network of contacts to build into. Before you know it, you can get involved in projects.
Can we just pull up the slide that I'm sharing, please? Thank you very much. The reason for showing this is twofold. The point of this slide is to emphasize that hydrogen economy is not just about the electrolyzers, but I ought to mention that Siemens actually makes the world's largest PEM electrolyzer, the Sealyzer 300. And if you put 3 of them together, you've got a 50 megawatt hydrogen plant that will make you 25 tons of hydrogen a day. So the opportunities to build hydrogen at scale are growing, and we see the scaling up of electrolyzers. We're going up an order of magnitude, something like every 4 or 5 years at the moment, in terms of size of electrolyzers and projects. But it's not just the electrolyzer. We've talked about sources of renewable energy, but there's the whole electrical system that provides the power. There's storage and buffering, there's compression, which is a major part of this, and then there are many uses. So depending what the particular expertise of your business might be, maybe you've got a sub-supplying role to some part of that, or maybe there's some part of that that you feel is your terrain. Or maybe there's something that you can put together with a group of other companies that does the end-to-end package, and make one of these auction-ready projects that hopefully Rita will be pleased to engage with next year. There were a couple of technical questions. One was about the use of water in electrolysis. It's less of a problem in this country than it might be in some very hot, sunny, dry places. But you can make quite a lot of hydrogen, or certainly a lot of energy content in the hydrogen from a relatively limited amount of water. There's obviously the sort of stoichiometric calculation of how many, what mass of pure water you need to make a certain mass of hydrogen. But above that, we normally need to clean up the water. So you probably need about 10 times that amount of water to sort of flush through the system and give you the clean water that goes in. But in terms of energy content, hydrogen is the most energy dense chemical fuel on the planet. So you don't need a lot of it to generate a lot of energy. It's not physically very dense, so you might need plenty of room to store it, but in terms of the mass, it has a very high calorific value. And in terms of the energy balance, most of the energy goes into splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. The additional sort of cost and effort involved in cleaning up the water that goes in the front end is relatively small, and much smaller than both the electrolyzer and the compressors that come on the back end of it. There are a couple of questions about injection of hydrogen into the gas grid, and various comments have been made so far this morning about, well, we might or we might not get involved in hydrogen for heating, both blending it in gas pipes or going for 100% hydrogen. Obviously, the gas network companies are very keen on the idea of 100% hydrogen, because otherwise they have a £40 billion stranded asset when we stop using natural gas. But there is a good case to be made for using some hydrogen for heating. The early opportunities with putting hydrogen in gas pipes are less about its impact on decarbonisation and more about the creation of an off-taker of last resort. One of the challenges in financing hydrogen projects is the counterparty risk. If you build the production capacity for hydrogen, what if your customer goes bust and can't buy it from you anymore? And so to know that as a fallback, there's always an opportunity to put some hydrogen into the gas grid, and it will play a small part in decarbonising heating more generally. That's a useful way of helping to get early projects off the ground. Did anyone pick up any of the other technical questions that they wanted to respond to?
I think probably just a couple of things to add to that, Matthew, in terms of I think we all conceptually get the idea of, hydrogen playing a role in cleaner gas, but we also need to make sure we're not just doing the wrong thing slightly less bad. So, if we can blend up to 20%, you're right, energy density for the same volume compared to natural gas is only a third. So actually you're only getting, 6-7% worth of energy out for that 20% you put in. But there's also a lot of additional things which I wouldn't pretend to understand all the technicalities of, around embrittlement and leakage and things like this. So I guess the point is, conceptually we all get it. But what we can't do is rely on that, for example, when we should be deploying renewable electricity, lower cost, and heat pumps, electric vehicles and whatnot in the meantime. So there's an idea for that, absolutely. I guess another thing that was mentioned to me by someone in the gas networks recently was, it's not even just the blend that we put in. If it was a constant blend, then that's almost, that's more attractive. than what could be a volatile blend. So our profile of injection of hydrogen into the gas network shouldn't be volatile either. So you're then asking for a steady demand, and if you've got a steady demand and a steady supply, that maybe doesn't help you fill in the gaps in what you thought was an offtake from someone else as well. Anyway, so I think the main thing is that there's nothing wrong with these things being explored. Of course it is. Maybe it's a wise thing to do as a transition, absolutely. But what we shouldn't do is not deploy that massive amount of heat pumps, for example, that we should be doing in the meantime.
I think that's a really important point, and I think we can sometimes get into this issue of this sort of like this is a zero-sum game in some way, which is just so far from the truth. We can deploy heat pumps as fast as we possibly can over the next decade, and if there's a role for hydrogen heating, we won't turn around and go, oh damn it, we deployed all the heat pumps, what a shame. We can move all of these at the fastest rate. We might have half a chance of getting to 2050 and decarbonising. The scale of the 2050 challenge cannot be overestimated. It is huge. And the key is to move forward with all of these technologies, deploy heat pumps as fast as we can, like make the kids see if there's an option for hydrogen heating, like move that forward as fast as we can. And I think, I think you made this point as well earlier. Let's not try and shoehorn hydrogen where electrification is a better option. There are places where hydrogen is better. There are places where electrification is better. The characteristics of them make them actually quite complementary in that nature. We actually, the task force, like to say, we borrow from the MasterCard advert. Electrification is great for a lot of things. For everything else, there's hydrogen. Let's not try and compete these technologies against each other, but let's just get moving with all of them, really.
Thank you. We've had over 40 questions already. So those that we don't get a chance to cover in the next few minutes, we'll try and follow up afterwards, and we'll put some questions and answers online along with the video of this presentation. An open question to all of you before we get to sort of summing up. Is there anything that one of you's heard one of the others say today that made you think hard about something? Benj, you went first, so you perhaps had more opportunity to listen to the others afterwards. Was there anything that surprised you, or that made you want to?
Not so much surprised me, but it really struck home, and it very much picks up actually what Claire and Barry both just said, and particularly Claire's point about, should we do this or that? Rita's comment around blue hydrogen as a pathway to renewable hydrogen, and that we shouldn't be trying to choose one or the other here. We've got to throw the kitchen sink, the proverbial kitchen sink, at getting to net zero. So the danger is, I think, that we try and figure out the right way to get to net zero in so much detail that we never actually start delivering it. So I think hydrogen is a great example where we need to do all of the above and a few things we haven't thought of yet if we're going to get to net zero. So it's time to stop talking and start doing, or carry on doing. Sorry, we're already doing. We need to do a lot more, and we need to accelerate it.
Claire, was there anything that one of the other speakers said that you particularly wanted to follow up on?
Well, it's actually something that you said in your introduction, Matthew, about the fact that we're going to need these huge gigawatts scale sort of electrolyzer factories, and actually some of that, and the fact that it takes a while for those factories to come online. And I think it just sort of reminded me, or sort of highlighted to me, that there's all sorts of things that we don't really even think about if you haven't been sort of involved in these kind of processes before. There's lots of delays and things like that we don't even really think about, and just sort of highlighted to me again the need to get moving as quickly as possible. It's like, when you get the builders in to do something to your house, it always takes twice as long as you think that it's going to. So just emphasize that need to get moving as quickly as possible.
I guess one of the messages.
Yeah, I think that for me that's the biggest one. Yeah, all the way back to your very start about speed and scale. I think the speed comes from the quick projects, the ones that are, you know, in the next 2-3 years, and they might be 10 to 50, maybe even 100 megawatt style projects in the next few years. But the level of the magnitude of numbers that we kind of talked about by 2030 and beyond, that is fairly staggering. So we should see it as a massive opportunity and a massive kind of call to action.
I think often these debates are framed as choices between hypothetical futures or future end states, when actually the reality is you get going, and the final balance between blue and green, or between heat pumps and hydrogen and district heating, that can come later. If you've got to, for example, decarbonize 25 million domestic gas boilers in the UK, you can afford to do 1 million of each technology before you need to even think about, you know, oh, is it going to be 60-40 at the end, or 40-60? But so often the lack of clarity of what the world in 2050 is like sort of blinds people with the headlights, the hydrogen headlights, to what we can do today. And when I've been drawing these various deployment curves just to get my own head around how quickly we need to go, the front end is always the same. It doesn't matter whether we're heading for 500 terawatt hours or 180 terawatt hours in 2050. It's still really important that we've got to tens of terawatt hours by the end of this decade. Otherwise, what follows on comes along too late.
I mean, all I would add to that, Matthew, is it's really important looking at deployment curves, but I think it's the demand curve that we should really be worried about getting up and running now, because as Rita said, you know, there's regulatory enablement coming, but we absolutely need to see that demand pull and that the potential for that scale up. You talk about what made your blade factory investable, it was demand. And that's what we need to see right now for hydrogen, and we need to see that that's going to grow over the next 20-30 years, and that makes a very investable space then for whether it's building gigafactories for electrolyzers, building more offshore wind to power them. That's what we need that really strong pull signal from the market.
Well, personally, I can't see supply matching demand for at least the next 5 years. Anyone who's tried to buy some green hydrogen recently, and we have, will know that it's really a seller's market. And every time we do something with hydrogen, a year ago we took some hydrogen along to Goodwood Festival of Speed just to demonstrate that you could provide off-grid power from hydrogen without burning diesel. That led to us doing a sort of a commercial unit on one of our construction sites, which we did a press announcement a month or so ago, since when we've been inundated with inquiries of other people who want to do clean off-grid power. And we're already struggling to source enough green hydrogen to be able to do these things. So I you know, if it was my own money, I would be just building on spec, because I think the opportunities to sell green hydrogen are, you know, new ones turn up every day. So I think the demand is there and can be there, and it's about unleashing the projects. Anyway, we're almost at the end of our hour. Is there a closing remark from each of you before we sign off? Claire, do you want to go first?
I guess just a little bit of a call to action. I think from both sides, it's often the case that industry looks to government and government looks to industry. And I think my encouragement would be that this is something where everybody needs to play their part. You know, hydrogen touches every part of the energy system. There's so much for everyone to get involved in. And we all need to sort of step up and be bold and ambitious and get this thing moving and then start to scale hydrogen in the UK, because the prize that is on offer, if we can get this right, is monumental. So yeah, encouragement to all work together on this.
Barry.
Yeah, So I guess I would try and summarise it like this. So the next kind of 12, maybe even 24 months has to be really heavy, intense, close working relationship with government, because that sets the foundations. The next 1, 2 to 5 years, I think we have to see, a right good spread portfolio of projects at a decent scale, so 20, 40, 50 megawatt, even bigger by 2025, but spread across applications, I would say. Because then by 2030, then you start to get into the proper 500 megawatt integrating with offshore wind, proper gigawatt scale projects by then. I think that's the 3 stages I have in my head. I think all the right parts are there. It's just kind of time to get on and start building stuff now.
Thank you. And Benj?
So I think it's been said. Let's get on with it.
Thank you. So we'll finish on time. Thank you in the audience for your questions and for sticking with us. There will be a recording afterwards. Please tell a friend and look out for the other events that are coming on over the next 2 days of I'm trying to remember what we're calling this, the All Energy and Decarbonise virtual festival that's happening this week. So thank you to the panel. And Rita, who had to leave, and thank you to the audience. And that's the end. Bye for now.